Once we get everything kind of cleaned up with the recording, we'll be posting it and we'll get a note out to you on where the link is that this will be shared. So if you have some others that couldn't attend today, that you'll be able to share this link. And they'll be able to watch this episode and our next 3 episodes also. So just real quick, we'll go ahead and get started. My name's Mike Parsons. I'm from DECA, which is based out of Lawrence, Kansas. In a nutshell, what DECA does is we work and strive to improve lives of others in Kansas. We have programs such as prevention, drug and alcohol treatment, child placement, foster care, traffic safety, opioid work. So we have a kind of a broad area that we cast our net over, and we've been around since the early 1970s. How we're involved today was an idea that Jennifer and Christy and I had after a Shawnee County DEC meeting. As you know, National DEC Day is April 28th. And we thought, why don't we do a little bit more to bring awareness to drug endangered children and try to have an event each Wednesday from 10 to 11. So that's where the idea came from. And we've gone ahead and got this going, and we've got one event each Wednesday from 10 to 11 the rest of the month. Today, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Stanton, who is the chairman of the board of the Kansas chapter of the Kansas Alliance. Then we're going to hear from Jennifer Gassman, and then Cindy Miles. We're honored with her, and she's going to share her personal story and how drug endangered children events have impacted her life and the lives of others that she knows. So with that, Tom, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Mike. My name is Tom Stanton. I'm the Reno County District Attorney, and I'm currently the chair of the executive committee of the KADEC Board of Directors. Welcome to our presentation this morning. What I'm going to do is kind of take you through a history of where we started, where we've come from. In 1990, the Kansas legislature passed a law that would become KSA 65-4159, which was the illegal manufacture of controlled substances. That gives you kind of a breakdown of when we started to see these issues start arising in Kansas. When I first became a prosecutor in Saline County, we didn't have methamphetamine issues. We concentrated on marijuana and cocaine. In 1993, I had my first methamphetamine possession case. And by 1994 and 1995, we were starting to see methamphetamine labs creep into our state and start to be a real problem. They're very dangerous things to deal with, all the chemicals involved. And what we found was that these methamphetamine labs were being used even in residences where there were children. And so there became a real issue as to drug endangered children. So at that point, we began to see these methamphetamine labs and methamphetamine use begin to take over people's lives. There was a need for a statewide response to manufacture and use of methamphetamine in Kansas. Shawnee County began what they called the Methamphetamine Prevention Project in 1999. The group received federal funding to make it a statewide organization in 2002, creating the Kansas Methamphetamine Prevention Project. That same year, members of the KMPP Board of Directors attended a conference in Arizona where they learned the concept of creating local alliances for drug endangered children. The KMPP, which originally was spearheaded by Christy Kane and Loretta Severin, used some grant funding to begin sponsoring conferences on the prevention of methamphetamine labs. After that, the KMPP created the Kansas Alliance for Drug Endangered Children, and Ms. Kane and Ms. Severin constituted the staff for both organizations. The group began sponsoring an effort to create local DEC alliances. In my case, Brenda Salvetti came to Reno County to help start the Reno County Alliance for Drug Endangered Children, and we were able to establish that within about 18 months. The board grew as more and more organizations recognized the need to protect children from drug-endangered environments. At that point, the KADC Board of Directors was made up of representatives of the organizations and professional disciplines that had become stakeholders in the KADEC. There were local DEC alliances across the state, which helped keep the KADEC prosperous. And our board meetings had many people attending. That came to be a little bit onerous, and we changed the bylaws to make the board constitute people who had the interest in a personal interest in the goals of the organization. So with many different areas of expertise represented, we were able to continue our work. While the KADC has continued to sponsor yearly conferences, local DEC alliances have faced challenges. The number of methamphetamine labs in the state decreased dramatically after the legislature created a statute that limited the availability of pseudoephedrine for purchase. This has not changed the focus of the KADEC, but since that was the focus of many of those local alliances, they began to falter some, and we started to lose some of those alliances. But we now have a broadened focus, that focus being drug use in the home. So it's no longer just methamphetamine labs or sales of drugs within the home, it's methamphetamine use or opioid use, because children are exposed to those drugs when they're being used. So we're trying to expand that focus. And in doing so, we are also wanting to expand the number of alliances, local alliances that we have in the state. We had a conference a couple of years ago in which this was discussed, and out of that came an idea for what was called the DEC Development Academy. Mike was very involved in that, and so was National. National and Dave Clausen out of Missouri got together and worked very hard to create a development academy to go to areas within our state and bring people together to focus on helping drug endangered children. So we recently engaged in the first DEC Development Academy within the last year, which was kind of tough because of COVID. So a lot of the in-person meetings had to become Zoom meetings, but we have several jurisdictions now in Kansas that are creating their own alliances, and we hope to create more in the future. That's kind of our focus. So our focus now is to continue to get the message out throughout Kansas that there is a need to protect children from drug endangered environments. And we will do so using events like this, sponsoring the conferences that we do every year, and by expanding the number of DEC alliances in Kansas. And I will turn it over now to Jennifer Gassman, and she has some information from what I would consider the strongest alliance in Kansas, Shawnee County.
All right, thank you, Tom. Again, my name is Jennifer Gassman. I am in Topeka, Shawnee County, and just a little information about our local alliance, as Tom was talking about how we very much want these local alliances. The Shawnee County Alliance has been in place since 2004, so about 17 years, which makes me feel really old saying that because I've been with it since pretty much the beginning. And so it's kind of crazy to think that we've been around for almost 20 years. It's a wonderful thought. With our local alliance, we have representatives, we have representation from lots of different players with drug endangered children. We have representatives from law enforcement, from our local law enforcement, from Department for Children and Families, from our Shawnee County District Attorney's Office. We have social workers from the hospital. We have a pediatrician. We have representation from our Community Child Mental Health Center, from Tiny K Infant Toddler Services. So we kind of have everybody that might be involved in the life of a drug endangered child. And we meet every other month. We've had constantly set meetings pretty much the entire time our alliance has been in place. So there's never any question of when we're meeting or if we're meeting. We meet the fourth Thursday of every month at 7:30 in the morning, and 7:30 in the morning might sound to people, but we do that for certain professionals like the doctor, who might have difficulty leaving during the middle of the day, but can be there early in the morning to join in on the meeting. We've had our child in need of care judges attend the meetings at times, and so people from the courthouse can attend meetings before that. And so we meet regularly just to make sure that we are all on the same page, that if there's any gaps that we're seeing in our systems, that we can talk about those and identify them and talk about what needs to happen if we're seeing children kind of fall through the cracks at some point in the system. We've developed a memorandum of understanding in our community that's a protocol for all different players. You know, if law enforcement comes across a child that's in a substance exposed environment, these are the best practice steps that they should take. You know, if a hospital has a baby that's born positive for substances at birth, you know, we have best practice steps that should be taken. So it's very clear to everybody, you know, what their role might be and what the best practice protocol would be. And we also have done lots of trainings, and we do community awareness. We've had conferences for Drug Endangered Child Awareness Day, where we've had displays of these onesies that are all hung up represent the number of babies that are born positive for substances in Shawnee County. And that's a great visual display for people to say, wow, okay, you hear a number, but then you look at those and it really makes an impact on what you see. So, so that's just a little bit about our work in Shawnee County. And I was just going to share with you some of the statistics we have for drug endangered children in the state of Kansas. Let me share my screen here. First off, just to talk about some overall numbers. In Kansas, it's estimated that we have 179,157 children that live in a home where they're exposed to substance use. And in Kansas, we have 4,185 newborns that are positive for substances, that are exposed to substances at birth or during pregnancy. What we do know is drug use impacts our children and families tremendously. Children whose parents use alcohol or drugs are 3 times more likely to be physically, sexually, or emotionally abused, and they are 4 times more likely to be neglected. So that means that there's a lot of children in our community that need help. So, and just some of the numbers that Department for Children and Families has seen with Child Protective Services intake reports. And these numbers are from July 2018 to July 2019. There were 73,407 reports made to DCF. 45,801 of those were assigned for investigation. And as related to substance use, 8,382 reports were assigned due to caregiver substance use. 1,832 reports were assigned due to child substance use. And there were specifically 1,237 reports that were assigned due to an infant testing positive for substances. 27% of Kansas youth reported yes to the question when asked, has anyone in your family ever had a severe alcohol or drug problem? 27% of children said yes to that. And in 2018, Kansas had 5,517 non-fatal drug overdose emergency department visits. Again, that's 2018, and we don't have the current numbers, but I do know those numbers are up. So for emergency department visits. So that was just so you could see some of the statistics that we're talking about, but the statistics are numbers and they only tell part of the story. So we are very fortunate to have with us today Cindy Miles, who is also on the board of the Kansas Alliance for Drug Endangered Children. And she's going to share with us her personal story about how her family has been affected by this issue. So thank you very much, Cindy. You're on mute, Cindy.
I'll start by unmuting. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yep.
So I appreciate you taking the time today to listen to my own personal story. And I really want to start today by going to the next screen, if it'll let me. So I want to start today by just telling you a little bit about us, not just myself, but about the man that I'm married to and my family. So my husband and I have been, at the time that we went through this, we were married 20 years. The experience that I'm gonna tell you about. We've now been married 30 years. We have 6 grown kids. We raised our kids very involved in their lives. We were members of the church. We are educated. We're a middle income family. And because I grew up in a situation where I experienced my own abuse, my mother was married and divorced 5 times. I was a victim not only of emotional abuse, but I was a victim of child pornography. My mother and one of her husbands involved me in child pornography. I was molested. It was not uncommon for me to hide my brother and sister from the abuse that was going on in the house of my mother. And so I worked very hard when I grew up to make sure that my kids did not have the same type of life that I had. And so I really committed myself to raising my kids not around drugs, not around alcohol, and in any other way that I could make my kids have a better life than what I had. And I want to start, or I want to go on next to introducing you to one of my grandchildren. This is Evan, and I've got a short video I'm going to share with you just to introduce you to Evan. Give me a second because I have to change the sharing screen that I'm sharing. Can you see that? Give me 1 minute. This is Evan. So Evan was my 15-month-old grandson that I lost in 2009. And he was very precious to me. And so that's why I wanted to introduce you to him today, because the loss of Evan is something that was so devastating for me. And with all that I had gone through in my life, I felt like I was prepared to deal with anything in my life. I'd worked really hard to get away from all the things that I had grown up with. And I had never expected to be in a position that I'd have to deal with the death of my grandchild. Sorry, technology. So October 19th was the day that I received a phone call and was told that Evan was being rushed to the hospital. I got a phone call from my mom who lived in Tulsa and was told that Evan was being rushed to the hospital because my youngest daughter had called her to tell her that he had stopped breathing. And so I got in my car and I rushed to the hospital expecting that everything would be okay. There, he had been sick for a couple of days, that things would be just fine. They would treat him. And when I arrived at the hospital, I also arrived to meet police officers that were telling me that there was some suspicion about what had happened to Evan. And we were suddenly being interviewed by police officers. They wanted to know what did I know about this situation? Was I familiar with this? They were hauling my daughter off for hours worth of interviews. We weren't allowed to be with Evan. And it was a traumatic experience. And over these next few days from October 19th to October 21st, on October 20th, I was finally allowed to see Evan. His mother wasn't allowed to see him. And I was brought in and sat by his side while they conducted tests to determine whether or not Evan was brain dead. I couldn't imagine that he would actually be brain dead. I sat there by his side and I fought for him and I prayed for him and I encouraged him, move a hand, move a foot, blink an eye, do something. And it didn't happen. And so by October 21st, they had made the decision that we would cut off life support from Evan because his brain was swelling and they didn't see any signs that his brain was any longer active. And so we did make the decision on October 21st to cut off life support, and they pronounced him dead. So the thing about this is I didn't see any signs of abuse of this child. He had an older sibling that I used to get quite often and bring to my house, my husband and I suspected there was drug use in the house. My daughter had had issues with drug use before. And yet, as a grandparent, I didn't know what to do about it. I'd see signs, I'd go over, I'd visit the house, I'd pick up Caitlin, I'd check on Evan. The kids were always clean, but I'd see signs that my daughter had scratched her face. She'd been picking at her face, which is a common sign of meth use. I'd nose around the house. I'd ask questions. And yet I was one of those grandparents, as many other people are, that really say, what do you do in this situation? Do you call and make a report to DCF? And what are you going to report? The kids look fine. I just didn't know really what to do about the situation. But I was sure that my grandkids were at risk because of the fact that I had no doubts that there was actually meth and or other drugs being used in the house. When the autopsy was completed on Evan, it was determined that he died of a head injury, a traumatic head injury. And I just couldn't imagine that anybody would hurt this child. The DA looked at the evidence and did decide that he did in fact die of a homicide related to child abuse. And both my 3-year-old granddaughter and another 6-year-old who lived in the house, which was the son of my daughter's boyfriend at the time, were taken into custody. I expected that after a few short weeks, I would see my granddaughter again, but I found out the system doesn't quite work like that. So initially, my daughter's boyfriend was arrested in relation to this. I had been around this man. I didn't see him as being somebody that would abuse, but what I learned about drug abuse, especially meth, is that it changes people. It changes who they are and what they might have traditionally been. They're not the same people anymore. They do things because they're so focused on the using of the drugs that they do things that they might traditionally not do. So I was so lost as to who was responsible for the death of my grandson. boyfriend was released from jail. There wasn't enough evidence to prove that he had anything to do with the multiple skull fractures or the other injuries that occurred at the time. And that left me wondering even more, who do I hold responsible in my heart? Who should I be angry at for the death of my grandchild? So the other kids, as I said, age 6 and 3, they ended up going into the foster care system. The 6-year-old eventually was adopted. The 3-year-old, after almost 4 months, 5 months maybe, came to live with me in a kinship agreement. And I can tell you, Caitlin at 3 didn't understand what was going on. This was a little girl that had always been with her mom. Her dad had died 6 months previous in a car accident where he had run his car off of a bridge because he was messed up on drugs. And she didn't understand, first losing her dad, then losing her brother, then losing her mom. She was devastated. And we would spend time together, and she would ask me, you know, when is Evan coming back? Or can we buy this toy for Evan? Or Evan would really like this car. We would talk about Evan all the time, and she couldn't comprehend the loss that she had experienced over the past 6 months. It was absolutely devastating to see how the use of drugs had so affected this little girl. My husband and I did end up being approved for adoption of her. And so we did adopt her. We have her to this day. She's 14 years old, and she's a beautiful young lady, but she's not without her issues. We've struggled with attempted suicides. We've struggled with cutting. We've struggled with self-confidence and issues with self-image. And so although we've had her for 10 years, she still continues to struggle with the issues that are related to the loss of her dad, the loss of her brother, and her mother continuing to use. I already really talked about the other kids and growing up with the struggles. The 6-year-old was adopted by another family. Unfortunately, there was nobody that was capable in his family or in the boyfriend's family to take the 6-year-old. And that all had to do with the drug use that they had within their family. There wasn't one adequate person to place him with. He just turned 18 and he just reached out. So it's sad to know that he's had to spend all these years because of drugs away from his family. So as if the story doesn't get any worse, I call this my other kids, the meth mess. So I told you I have 6 grown kids. 3 of my daughters made the choice at some point in time in their grown lives to get involved with meth. And as a result of their use of meth, you see these kids up here, 12 of them, that have been impacted by the use of drugs. And I want to tell you their stories really quick, because my youngest daughter had Evan, Caitlin, Malachi, and Lily. Evan, who passed away. Caitlin, who I adopted. Malachi, who was born the year after Evan died, and my husband and I adopted. And Lily, who she had when she lived in Oklahoma and ended up in not in the foster care system, but in a placement. She was removed from the home after her parents were arrested for distributing meth. And so she spent almost a year in the system in Oklahoma. I wasn't able to bring her here. Heather, Haley, and Hunter, who I ended up with Heather and Haley. I had them in a guardianship agreement for 5 years after my oldest daughter, who was a dispatcher for Tulsa 911 for 10 years, got so overwhelmed with her job that she got involved with drugs, which led to meth, which led to homelessness. She couldn't take care of her kids. And so I brought her kids here to take care of her kids. During the time that she was out using, she got pregnant by the drug dealers, another drug dealer who she was pimping herself out to. She got pregnant with Hunter and gave birth to Hunter in the back of an ambulance while she was staying at a cheap hotel. She didn't have any prenatal care. And I, as a grandparent, went to visit Hunter, but had to report to the hospital that she couldn't leave the hospital with this child. And it was one of just another hard thing that I had to do in my journey, because no grandparent wants to call and tell a hospital or a social worker that their grandchild can't go home with them. And I knew, because I already was raising 4 grandchildren, my husband and I knew we couldn't take on another grandchild. No spring chickens anymore. And so Hunter was taken into protective care and eventually placed with a distant friend of the family that ended up adopting him. He dealt with lots of issues from her using meth the entire time that she was pregnant with him. And it was hard. We don't have any connection with Hunter these days. The person that adopted him doesn't allow us to have connection with him through no fault of our own. Then there's Caden and Noah, who are children of my middle daughter. I've got too many kids. I can't keep up with them. Sorry. Their mother got involved with meth, and fortunately they had a solid father that could take care of them, but she was in and out on the streets, in and out of jail. I thought headed to prison several times. Her kids are unstable as a result of what she has put them through, coming and going and coming and going. The oldest one, Caden, suffers with depression. And then I have Titus, Kinsley, and Carter, who my son has, my youngest son. Those are his kids. And while my youngest son has never used, the mother of his kids, Titus, Kinsley, and Carter, has struggled with meth. And she has been in and out of their lives, which has also been very devastating to them. And recently, just to give you an example, I had Kinsley, who is 5, in my office, and I work downtown in Wichita, and there was a police car that went by with his siren on, and Kinsley stood up and said, "Oh my goodness, I hope that that's not my mom getting arrested, because she needs to go to the doctor because she's pregnant and she needs to get the baby checked out." So I've watched a lot of devastation that has occurred by the drugs that my children have chosen to get involved with. I would have never expected my children to get involved with drugs. I didn't raise them that way, but this is a second marriage for me. And their father was an addict, an active addict that got very involved in meth himself. And as much as I tried to protect them and keep them away from using, you really can't do anything about that, what's ingrained, I guess, in the kids from the nature versus nurture. And so it's been devastating to watch what these kids have gone through. So this is my grandson. And when he died on October 21st, 2009, and we buried him 10 days later, I sat by his grave and I promised him that I couldn't save him, but I'd do anything and everything that I could do to save the other kids. And I've sought out over the years ways to be involved, ways to make an impact. It's very hard to do. I sat at a Wichita Coalition for Child Abuse Prevention meeting recently and explained to the group that doing the work for me is, it requires me to continually think about the experience that I've been through, the loss, the struggle that the kids have faced, struggles that I never thought I'd see my grandkids face, struggles that I worked really hard to make sure that my family wasn't impacted by, because I had been impacted by some of these things. But it's also healing in a way to know that maybe I can have an impact on other kids out there. Maybe I can do something that will make a difference. So if you look at this chart from the Child Death Review Board, I find it interesting that my grandchild is there, and that 10 children that died in 2009. And that's hard that he was one of 10. I don't think there should be any kids that should die. And when I got involved with the Wichita Coalition for Child Abuse Prevention, one of the questions that I had to ask for myself personally was, how many of the kids that we're seeing that are abused are being abused because it's tied to drugs? I wanted to know. I think that's something that is such important work. When I go to the coalition and they tell me that 25% increase is what we're seeing a year in child abuse and neglect, and I ask how many of those cases are related to drugs, and I hear that the numbers are 95% of kids have some tie. Some of their abuse or neglect or the death of these children is tied to drugs. I think we got to work harder. We got to do more. We got to address that root cause, because otherwise we're not going to save these kids. I also look at the prevention points that are made in the report by the Child Death Review Board. And I think these are kind of interesting prevention points, because as I do some of the work that I do, I hear that we need to create stronger families. We need to teach parents how to parent. We need to provide more resources. But I can tell you firsthand from those parents who are involved in meth or other drugs, they're not going to care about any of those resources. I can tell you firsthand that they're concerned about getting and using and finding ways and means to get more drugs. That's what they're concerned about. We've got to approach things in a different way, in my opinion. And I am so appreciative for all of the work that all of you do, because I don't know that I could go out and do the work that you do every day. I don't know that I could deal with hearing about more cases than what I already engage myself in hearing about. But I certainly think some of these prevention points are valid points. I want to kind of wrap up and give you all time to ask questions, anything that you want to ask me, but I also want to, I don't want to leave this on a down note, and I want to share with you the miracle about where my family is today. And although these kids that you see here in these pictures, they have their struggles, they're in therapy, they're not as stable as they should be. Today, all of my kids are clean. I have a daughter that just celebrated 6 years clean, my oldest daughter, Kara works as a drug case coordinator for ComCare. She goes out and works with other people that have drug issues. And I was so thrilled that she just celebrated 6 years clean. She has her kids back after 5 years. She moved here and I was able to reintegrate her kids with her. And she's able to finish raising her kids. My youngest daughter, Casey, has been clean for about 4 years. She works for Higher Ground. She's a peer mentor for other people who have drug issues. She got her daughter Lily back. They've worked on therapy and pulling their lives together. And she's now re-engaged with the life of Caitlin and Malachi, who are 14 and 10 now. My middle daughter, who you see there on the couch, as my middle daughter, she's clean. She's been clean for several years. She's rebuilding relationships with her kids. These are miracles because I understand the number of people that actually get and stay clean after using meth for years is very few. I can only say that to have these kids clean today is a miracle. Unfortunately, my youngest son, who you see laying on his side on the couch, is still dealing with the mother of his kids using. She just got out of treatment again. I don't know, what her chances are. She had a very different life than what my children had. But that's where they are today. The kids they're not perfect. They all have their issues. We're all working together as a family as how do we heal? How do we restore? And how do we give hope to other families? How do I give hope to other grandparents or other people who are dealing with some of these same issues? That's my story. There's my contact information. I'm always available to visit with anybody, to tell them any other things that they want to know about my story, about what I've learned about the system, about my perspective from the other side, as opposed to being somebody that works in the system, but somebody that has dealt with so much in the system and learn more about all of that than I ever really wanted to know. So I'd open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Wow, I've heard parts and pieces of that story, and I'm just really glad that the ending part is so positive, with everything that you've shared. I do have one question. Have your kids ever told you maybe what the turning point was for them to start on the road to being clean? I know you mentioned, I think the longest one has 6 years now.
Yes.
Was there some sort of turning point there that started them down that road?
I think for each of them, it was different, Mike. All of them had to find a bottom. For my middle daughter, her bottom was she was headed towards going to prison. If she didn't change, she was going to go to prison. And she had already lost so much that was her turning point. For my youngest daughter, Casey, who's lost so much, including her child to death, it was, I think, realizing that she had lost so much, and especially wanting to re-engage with her kids, after her and now her husband, who was the boyfriend at the time, after they spent some time in jail, and then they lost another child, Lily, and they lost Lily for a year. That was an eye-opening for her. Now, why, I wonder, wasn't the death of her son, wasn't, because I would have thought, in my opinion, that would have been what would have turned me around, but it wasn't. Right. And with my oldest daughter, she found herself sitting one day on a bench at a bus stop. And I think it just hit her, all that she had lost and living on the streets and all that she had experienced, that she just couldn't do it anymore. And there was my mother in the background sending lots and lots of prayers on an ongoing basis until she passed away. But that's what they share with me.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone else have any questions for Cindy?
I do. Cindy, my
Yes.
name's Shelley Bigham. I work in Topeka. I'm a child protection specialist. Thank you very much for sharing your story. So where he asked you, what might have turned your kids around, have they ever told you why they started using meth in the first place? I feel like I'm former law enforcement. I served 10 years in law enforcement. I found it interesting that Thomas Stanton started his career in Saline County. I was actually a Salina Police Department officer. But anyway, it just blows my mind that what we know about meth is so horrible and it's so hard to get off of. Why do we still have kids or people even trying the substance? I mean, there are other things. I'm not a proponent for drugs at all, but why they choose and because meth is just so tough. I don't understand why we haven't combated that.
So, Shelley, a couple of things along those lines is, so my youngest daughter got involved in using drugs when we moved to Wichita, and she was in middle school, and she was hanging out with some kids from collegiate that were using drugs, and she got involved in drugs, and she spiraled from there. It was devastating to me because I had taken my kids when they were a baby, a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, and left my abusive husband, their father, and ran as far away as I could get from that environment, because that wasn't how I wanted to raise my kids, but that's what I had grown up in. And so she got involved with drugs, and she just connected with the wrong people. And I fought really hard. Like, how can, after you've seen what your father has been through, how can you possibly get involved with drugs? And I did everything I could to protect them. So she just got in with the wrong people. With my oldest daughter, she started 10 years with 911, and she would call me and she would tell me stories, and she got involved with prescription pills of different kinds, which eventually led to meth. And most of her friends were police officers because that's who she knew. So that one shocked me the most. And, she was in her late 20s when she got involved with drugs. This girl never even smoked a cigarette because she was, that's how she was. And then with my middle daughter, she had fibromyalgia, and she was being given prescription pain pills, Lortabs, and eventually couldn't get those anymore and ended up using meth.
Yeah. I think that's just the saddest thing that, I know we're always going to have struggles. I would just love to also be involved in something that helps us get rid of the meth. I mean, I said, I know there's lots of different drugs out there, but meth, at least my history and seeing it, is just one of the toughest, that no matter how much people want to get away from it, it is just so hard. So their struggle is just so much harder with that. And that's why I wish we could, I don't know if it's getting to the kids when they're younger and share your story being shared with the younger generation. I don't know if that's the answer or not, but thank you for sharing your story.
Well, I share my story because I hope my story will make a difference. As I prepare every time for a presentation, it's heartbreaking. I still struggle. The death of a grandchild is not a death that I will ever recover from. I spent months, well, actually more than a year, in a fog. just breaking down, constantly crying. And I reached out to other grandparents, and I created Parenting Again Club to reach out to other grandparents to try to provide them support and understanding, and just the opportunity to call me if it's at midnight and say, I need to talk. I don't know, what to do. And I've got these grandchildren that have been in this situation. Often they've been exposed to drugs and they're unruly, and I don't know how to control their behavior. And I'm angry at them, but yet I say, but it's not the kids' fault. It's the environment they came out of. You can't take it out on the kids.
I could interject just a second. I think that that's the whole reason that we have the KADEC and the reason that we're pushing for these local alliances. These local alliances are set up so that you have prosecutors, judges, law enforcement, substance abuse counselors, DCF, everybody comes together in your community. And there are some excellent MOUs that we can get from Shawnee County. They've developed theirs, and that we're happy to share. But that's the reason for the KADEC is to answer that question that was just posed to Cindy, is that what can we do? As professionals, we have to recognize the dangers in family environments these kids go through. Kids involved with situations where their parents are using fentanyl are in danger of death every day. And that's becoming more and more prevalent. In our community, law enforcement won't even test drugs anymore. They send them off to the lab because of just the possibility that fentanyl could be present. So the more the opioids are used in the home, the more the meth is used, more the marijuana is smoked, the more danger these children are in. So
Yes.
what we try to do with these alliances is to create partnerships where when something is recognized, when this kind of a situation is recognized by DCF or anyone else in the community, there can be a response, not only to save the kids, but also to get the parents the assistance they need. Other efforts have been things like drug courts, which we have here in Reno County, where you concentrate on figuring out how to get people off the drugs, not just giving them a criminal penalty, but how do we deal with their substance abuse disorder, and how do we deal with any mental disorders that go along with that? Those co-occurring disorders are prevalent among the people that we work with in our drug court. So one of the things we're trying to do with this event and with others and with the conference is to get the word out throughout the state, so people in their local communities will form these alliances and will do the work needed to be done in local communities to save these kids.
And I just want to follow up on that, because again, going back to when I first came to the Wichita Coalition for Child Abuse Prevention 10 years ago and got, asked to be involved with that coalition because I needed an outlet for combating child abuse. I was really shocked at that point in time when I asked how many kids, what are the statistics of kids that are experiencing abuse or neglect or removed from the home that's tied to substance abuse. And I was told, we don't measure that. And I'm like, why would we not measure that? Because from what I have seen, that's a root cause. And if we don't address that issue, through the work that the Alliance does, how do we make changes in the lives of these kids? No matter how many parenting classes you offer them or other things that are offered to them, if you don't address the drug use, we can't make the changes that need to be made to save these kids.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Cindy. Anybody else have any questions or comments? I do know that there's some other states that are on the meeting today or on the call that are interested in getting some alliances up and going in their areas. If you guys happen to have any questions about getting started, or if you'd like to get any questions answered about the DEC Alliance, Kansas was the first and so far the only state that's gone through the DEC Alliance Academy with the help from the national folks and the PTTC. Just feel free to get in touch with us. You can go ahead and email myself, which is mparsons@deca.org. And I believe that's on the flyer that's going out. And we'd be glad to kind of help you out, answer any questions you have, kind of tell you how we got started and what directions we've headed. So far, it's helped out. We've got seven new alliances so far in the last year, with a kind of a reintegration or refiring and interest of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more counties. So just in our efforts in the last year, we've got like 12 alliances that are kind of getting up and getting running, getting started across the state. So it's been a real benefit for us in Kansas to have gone through it, and we're willing and welcome to help anyone out that we can. And that's one thing that we decided when we were going to do these events, was just how can we continue to get the word out? How can we get awareness out there? This week we focused on kind of how the personal stories, you know, can hit close to home. We talked a little bit about the history of it. And then next week we're going to actually have Dr. Carrie Weeks, who's the associate professor, the director of Child Abuse and Neglect Division with the KU hospitals out of the Wichita area. And she's going to not only talk about what they're seeing from her point of view, she's also going to talk a little bit about the meth and the opioid effects that they're seeing with the children, and kind of the long-term effects of what's going through there. So we're looking forward to that. Then the week after that, we have the Montana Institute, who's going to present for us, who's going to talk about the resiliency and the hope of children and positive community norms, which kind of talks like what Cindy was describing about coming back from, you know, different steps or different pieces of addiction, of their cycles, and how not only the ones that have gone through the addiction piece themselves, but those that have been affected by it, that those experiences and those positive things in their life can really be helpful, and the resiliency, and these kids can bounce back and you know, have a productive life in front of them, that it's not always just going to be something negative that's happened to them, where they're going to definitely just follow down that same path as so many kids can do if there's not change involved. So then the last week we're going to have is with National DEC, and they're going to talk about what's going on nationally, what's going on with their mission and vision statements, some changes with that. And then they're also going to talk a little bit about and launch, do like a soft launch of their new phone application that it's a mobile app that you can use that will help with getting alliances started and kind of keeping in communication with folks. It looks pretty exciting. I'm actually kind of excited to learn more about it myself. So, and that's kind of a quick rundown on what's going to happen for the month. We're very glad that you guys could join us. It's 11 o'clock. So if we don't have any other questions, we'll let you go. I am going to pop an evaluation here in the screen for you guys to, let me see here, chat.